I have a very strong view in terms of the roles of, what I would call branding, classic marketing, innovation, and sort of country growth. How you grow a business like Innocent, or how you grow a business like Tony's, how you find the right balance between investing in each of those three things.
Yeah, let's go into it, because this is perfect. So what were they again? They were the
so from a kind of sort of brand marketing point of view, what I would call a rolling innovation plan. And then sort of geographic expansion. If you look at those three things in balance, I think in the past people said, well, you've got your core range, and therefore you should then just put loads and loads of marketing money behind those things and grow it, and then occasionally do innovation, and as a sort of last resort, kind of expand geographies. And I've always just looked at it quite differently in terms of, I'm a man that likes irons in the fire and options, because not everything works. So you don't want to bet the house on anything. And therefore, from my point of view, innovation, particularly in a business like Innocent and Tony's, where you can do innovation relatively cheaply, you can roll out quite a few products. And as long as you're disciplined about then backing the ones that work and quickly dropping the ones that don't, I think is just a really powerful way to grow the business. What you see from the big guys is they will get a launch. They will probably take too long to getting it to market because they'll have done 58 pieces of research. There's a lot of fear inside big companies about failure. And so they over-research it. Then they're a little behind on their timing, and somebody else has got the latest trend out in the market. So then they say, well, this must work. So then they pile in loads and loads of marketing money at day of launch. And get 1 in 10 works, and that's the stories you hear, but 9 out of 10 don't. And then there's a sort of inquisition into the business. Why did this fail? It's like the conclusion is normally then, well, we better research the next one a bit harder. And guess what? It takes even longer. So you create fear. What I tried to do at Innocent, and picking up from where the founders left off, and what we do at Tony's is, how do you remove the fear from failure? And if you remove the fear from failure, and you try what I would call small to medium-sized bets, it's really easy then to turn the marketing taps on to things that work. And I have a great belief that if the thing is not selling on shelf without marketing ain't going to save it one way or the other.
Wow.
So I'm a much bigger believer in putting something on shelf, seeing its first 3 or 4 months rate of sale. If it's above the threshold, that's when you pile in with the marketing money. That's when you really back the thing, because you've already halved your risk by saying, well, this thing's already selling. I'm now trying to get it from the second quartile maybe into the first quartile. I haven't bet the house or my marketing pot on a thing that was always going to be in the fourth quartile, and maybe if I'm lucky, I'll get it to the third quartile. So we always had a program of rolling innovation, and then you back the winners, rather than you kind of bring it all together on day one and you make these kind of big, this year's all about the marketing money going behind this one thing. For me, that never made any sense.
Are there any specific examples, Innocent or Tony's, of that rolling innovation, brand and marketing pillar here, rolling innovation pillar 2, geographic expansion pillar 3, of that working with you guys?
Yeah, so on the countryside, what you have to understand, I've never seen a market get to any meaningful scale, certainly within 3 years, and typically within 5 years. So when I'm thinking about, and we, Innocent, as you know, went from nothing to over 500 million, and Tony's, in the last couple of years, we've grown the business over 100 million. And you can't just rely on one thing, but you also have to understand with the countries, I'm now making bets on sort of markets. We've gone into Australia, we're rolling into Canada. I kind of go, I've launched them, but they're not my big thing. What I'm hoping is that they're going to be my big thing in year 3 to 5. So that's going to deliver meaningful growth for me at scale. Not when it's at 1 to 2 million, it's when it's suddenly going from 5 to 15 million. Suddenly that's 10 million of growth in a year, because you've done the groundwork, because you've built the retailer relationships. Country growth is just on this much longer lead time. So you have to think about, okay, what do I want? Where do I want scale coming in year 2, 3, or 4? And some of those markets won't work as well. So you're laying down a sort of set of bets on a certain timetable on countries. On innovation, certainly in the chilled juice world, where you could get stuff to market quicker, it's a bit slower in a 12-month chocolate world. Again, you're laying bets, but they're much sort of shorter term in terms of the binary, does it work, does it not work?
Yeah, sure.
The reaction, obviously, from does it sell on shelf, does it not, happens really quite quickly. But I'm also, again, there's a big difference between launching another flavour of your existing product or launching, a completely new range, whether it's a kind of seasonal range or whether it's sort of, in our case, sort of tinies, which are the small chunks wrapped as a sort of gifting product.
Yep.
Those are very different types of bets. And again, so I'm always just thinking about the layers of bets I've got going, knowing that I also can afford one or two of them not to work and still deliver good growth.
Layers of bets.
So this sort of idea of this year's about one thing, and everyone says you should focus. I'm like, if you want to grow a business from 100 to 500 million, you've got to be smart and you've got to be tactical, but focusing on one thing won't get you at pace from 100 to 500 million. So I guess the contrarian view, long way back round to the original question, is probably I don't believe in the one big thing kind of strategy. I believe in, and I've scaled Innocent and we're scaling Tony's with a kind of.
So what were some bets you placed maybe 2 years ago or a year ago where you're like, right, these are my bankers, and just go through that again, that three things: brand marketing, rolling innovation, country.
Let's sort of pick up from where Adam left off, the kind of Innocent phase where I took over. The business is already at 200 million, so you're like, this is a pretty good.
Yeah.
Where do I go from here?
Yeah.
These guys have done a pretty damn good job, and obviously I've been part of that. But their name above the door. What we had there was we had some countries seeded. And we had principally, we got going in juice. So we'd had the smoothies, we'd made the transition to juice. What I then did was say, okay, we need another layer to smoothies. So we had the core smoothies, but they'd kind of hit the nothing but fruit thing, had done brilliantly for the business. And there was this sort of mantra inside the company, like, yeah, but that's the magic. I was like, no, the quality of the product is the magic. So when we said, well, let's do super smoothies with added vitamins, they're like, but we're nothing but fruit. And you're like, no, that was explaining that range, not explaining the company. And so we made a bet on super smoothies, which was basically, inside the angst inside the business was huge. It was like, but. So we had to lay a bet to say, no, we're going to do smoothies with added vitamins with a kind of positioning about, energy or gut health or whatever it may be. So we laid that bet. We then, obviously, the juice bet moving into carafes with juices, not just smoothies, was working. So again, how do you expand that from core apple juice and orange juice into multiple flavors alongside that? And then what we were doing was we were saying, right, Germany, France, Scandinavia, how do we properly invest with not just demonstrating for the sale process that they worked, you actually then had to make them work.
Yeah.
How do you invest behind those things? And particularly with France, we made a very meaningful bet in a field sales force team to say the only way to scale in France is you basically got to hire 20 people way ahead of your revenue curve to get visibility and distribution on shelf. So there's your map of three different things going on at the same time. Where do I then put my marketing money? Well, it turned out that juice was the absolute flyer at this point, so it was really driving revenue. So that's why.
Sorry, was this the superfood juice?
No. This was just at this time. This was apple and orange and kind of mango, tropical juice. So we came to super juices later.
Right. Okay. Then you got the tap of marketing and brands that you.
So we put it behind the thing that was really driving at the time. Now with super smoothies, we launched them. They did okay, but what we then did was did lots of editing. So we had sort of dark labels and we had 4 different positionings. What we could see was that the energy one, effectively natural energy, was the one that was selling. So very quickly, within a year, we positioned them all, different flavors around natural energy. At that moment, they really started to work. So we did about 3 different iterations over about 18 months. and you suddenly saw the rate of sale go. And again, that's the point we put the marketing money behind the super smoothies. And guess what? Then juices were starting to tap out a little because their distribution. So it was okay, from super smoothies to super juices. So you're just kind of layering one on top of the other, and all of the while the kind of country growth was happening.
Yeah.
And again, once France got to a certain scale, I could then say, right, I'm actually going to properly put some marketing money, because I'm not just a Carrefour central, Monoprix Central Paris brand. I'm now a national brand. I can see that my rate of sale is starting to grow. Let's do some national advertising in France. And again, that then really moved the dial. But we were 7 years into France, and we'd lost a lot of money before we put meaningful advertising money, marketing money down.
How did you guys get France moving specifically? Like, what actually happened?
So, again, we had this original strategy of Brits abroad. So it had worked so well in the UK. I was like, well, take some British people who love innocent and put them in France.
Them in Paris.
What could possibly go wrong? I mean, everything went wrong. And again, I've referenced before, but consumers are much more the same across Europe than everyone will tell you.
What do you mean by that? So,
Well, I've spent years both in chocolate and previously in juice where everyone says, oh, but my consumers in Scandinavia like this kind of thing, and my consumers in France, like what you've got in Britain will never work. We're like, well, we can't afford to have bespoke flavours and bespoke levels of strawberry and guess what? If you get your positioning right, everything sells pretty well in most European markets. So from a product point of view, you can scale a European brand, and to some extent, like we are doing now in the US, a US brand with the same portfolio. So if everyone tells you it's in the product, the difference is, I challenge that. I think it's in your positioning in market by market. In France, it's like Germany, like Scandinavia, the commercial execution is so different. You need people that understand how to sell and build retailer relationships and understand where the margin goes in the P&L, because where you give margin is completely different in France to where you give it to Tesco. So you need that expertise. So what the second phase, which worked, was hire people that understand the trade strategy and make them fall in love with innocent, rather than send people who are in love with innocent and go and make that work. So that was the sort of strategy that we took.
Yep.
And then with the brand, and one of the things I'm proudest of my time at Innocent, is that the French think it's a French brand.
What? I didn't. What?
Because
Please tell me more.
Well, because again, we said.
How did you do that?
Well, because I think we hired some. Eventually, we hired some good commercial people, and we hired someone that could tell jokes in French. So, our packaging was where you told the stories, right? So you then started in a very small way doing the French social media and the French packaging with people that understood French humour. So you're not copying and pasting English jokes and putting them on French packaging. And then we did, the first big push we did was a kind of a sort of homage to Paris and how we loved Paris and all the rest of it. So it's unusual for an international brand to sort of then do that. So over time, what the feedback was, It got to scale, and they thought it was a French brand, kind of a young entrepreneurial French brand coming through. They hadn't sort of really, obviously some people knew, but in general, it was loved like it was a local brand. And I think that's powerful, because you gave local marketeers the opportunity to kind of mold the macro positioning, the macro sense of fun to that local market. And that was really powerful. And now when I look at the US, you kind of roll forward 10 years, and I'm now sitting at Tony's, and we're doing the same thing. Again, what you need, we've got the same product set in the US. And everyone says, but the Americans love this, and it'll never work. The US is now the biggest part of our business. So it's now, we sell more in the US now than we do in the Netherlands, which is a sort of mind-blowing transition for the business, with the same product set. But again, the marketeers have the freedom to sort of say, well, you'd probably need to find a different balance between ethics and taste in the way that you communicate to US consumers than you did when you launched it in Amsterdam, where it was very much about the ethics 15 years ago.
So I was speaking to Nicola about this before we jumped on, mate. But like the podcast that went out today was with Seth Godin, obviously a big marketing genius, and he detailed your story.
Right.
One of the questions was like, how do you go from smallest viable audience, that sort of bell curve, adoption curve, where you go from early adopters and you've got across the chasm to sort of the rest of the market. And he's like, the story with Tony's right when it started to get those diehard fans was the piece about all the ethics, and of course we're going to get on to all of this, changing the chocolate supply chain, the purpose. As you get bigger, you need, and he says where most brands go wrong is one, just because you're successful when you're early doesn't mean you're going to be successful as you get bigger. And two, he says, the best brands create a shareable status story for their consumer. So it's the shareable status story of Tony's, and I'm just bouncing ideas around here, could be like when it started, you rock up to a dinner party, it's like, this chocolate they're saving the supply chain, right? That's what Seth said. But as you get to be a bigger brand 10, 15 years later, the story is, as you go mass market, is these American parents rocking up to a Halloween party, and the shareable status story of the brand is less about the ethics of the brand and more about, oh my God, look how thick the chocolate is. Look at the taste. Look at the crazy packaging. And I think the way he detailed it in like 2 minutes was like insane. But it's interesting what you're saying about America and how that market's beginning to take shape with the marketeers based on that, and like the way the shareable story changes. Like,